Thank you for joining me on this Museum Monday here with the Sacramento History Museum. Today I'm having tea and I'm reading a few of my favorite books, and we're celebrating this month, a month of celebrating with love and courtship and all the things that come with February the 14th. So I'm excited that I get to start the month by talking about a few of our courtship rules that you would follow if you lived a long time ago. Later in the month, we'll be making Valentines. We'll be maybe giving advice to some people who are not as lucky in love as some of us. And we'll be celebrating love just in general for the month of February. So today we're starting with, perhaps you can notice here, one of our favorite authors, Jane Austen, but also just the Regency period. If you, like most of the staff here at the museum, enjoy the TV show Bridgerton, that is on Netflix now, perhaps you will recognize some of the courtship and rituals that we will be discussing today. And we wanted to look at some of these rituals and look at how they changed over time, and how we talk about the Regency period and then we move into the Victorian period, and then of course later on we've got Georgian and just all sorts of different periods that have their own courting rituals. Now, the Regency period is one of my favorites. It's also one that we are most familiar with because of authors like Jane Austen, who wrote at length about many of the rituals that her heroines faced at the time. So I thought we would start with our Regency courtship rituals. And some of the rules that they had to follow. Perhaps that is what is most important, is that these courtships, these were very structured things. There was a lot of etiquette, a lot of rules that you needed to follow in order to be seen as honorable and as, worthy of finding a husband that would be a good husband. Now, at the time, of course, marriage was not necessarily all about love like it is today. It was about finding a match who could support you financially, could support you in a lot of ways that were more material rather than through your love, because love will grow after the marriage, of course. So the courtship was more about learning about the other person, but not and hoping that you find them pleasing, but not necessarily falling in love right away. And while we talk about this, we should note as well that what we're discussing with Regency is Regency England. So this is the higher class of people in England at that time, and kind of the social etiquette that they had to follow. Now, one of the things, perhaps you remember from our show, Bridgerton, you would never be alone with a lady. Never. Don't go to the dark garden or the dark alley or whatever it is in that show. Okay, don't do that. That is a big no-no. You should never, ever be alone with whoever that you are courting at the time. And ladies, I'm talking to you. This isn't necessarily true for the men. If a lady was found alone with a man, her reputation is ruined. Probably her family would suffer as well, but the man would maybe get a reprimand and then carry on with his day and go find another lady to court. So it is quite unfair. But absolutely never be alone. You're always chaperoned, and the chaperone could be a parent, could be a brother, but had to be usually somebody who was maybe married, and they would follow you everywhere. So after you would meet, which would often be at a ball or would be a social function of some sort, you would meet, and you would actually, you wouldn't be able to just go up to somebody and say hello. You would have to be introduced to that person, usually by the hostess. So the hostess actually had quite an important role in making marriages at this time, because she would be the one who had to introduce you. A third party had to introduce you, otherwise it was very improper, very improper. So after you met, then the next day the gentleman might send flowers to you, and that is true. We saw that quite a bit in our show. And then might call on you in person as well. That was okay, again, chaperoned. Also, you might promenade. That would be okay, as long as you're promenading in open space. You had your chaperone nearby. You could also go in a carriage, as long as it was an open carriage and there was plenty of people around in order to see you. And you could do things like that. Now, one of the things that we see a lot of in other books, for example, Sense and Sensibility, is writing letters. Now, writing letters is a wonderful way to grow affection for a person, because often you might write a poem for the one that you are trying to attract. But the problem with letters at the time is that you could not send it through the post. You could bring it to someone in person, but if you were sending letters to a lady or a gentleman through the post, it was pretty much assumed that you were already engaged, well on your way to the altar. So perhaps in Sense and Sensibility, you remember Marianne writing letters to Willoughby and sending them to him. Well, that is why a lot of people in the book assume that she was engaged, because that would have been a very improper act. It's also why in Pride and Prejudice, when Mr. Darcy writes Lizzie the letter, kind of explaining his actions, he brings her the letter in person. He does not send it in the post. It is not written to her and addressed to her, but sent from him. He hands it to her in person, and that's very important, because social etiquette at the time would have said, oh, you're engaged. Another thing that you would have been assumed engaged is if you had taken, if you had danced more than 2 dances with somebody at a ball. Yes, indeed, if you wanted to dance with someone because you enjoyed their company, only 2 was the number that you could. So in Pride and Prejudice, when Mr. Collins, for example, tells Lizzie that he is going to, his desire is to remain close to her throughout the night, what he's saying is, whoops, one second, technical difficulties, that'll happen. What Mr. Collins is saying by saying he wants to be near Lizzie during the night or throughout the ball is that he is kind of showing his intentions there. He's saying, yeah, I would like to be engaged to you. So Lizzie really should have clued in a little bit more the night before his disastrous proposal. Now, of course, during these times, you could write, you could promenade, you could sit in a parlor, chaperoned. You couldn't touch, of course, that was very improper. But then eventually you would assume that a proposal is coming. And this is where the ladies really had a little bit more power. All of these things is kind of dependent on the gentleman. The lady could dress up and look good, and hopefully she had a dowry that would make it a good business transaction for the gentleman that would make her desirable in that way as well. But it was really with the proposals that the woman had a lot of power. So the lady could then refuse, of course, like Lizzie did twice with Mr. Collins and Mr. Darcy, or she could accept, and that was sort of sealing her fate. The lady also could break an engagement. It was highly improper for a gentleman to break an engagement, even though if he decided that it wasn't a good match, it would have been highly improper. Again, in Sense and Sensibility, you see Edward Ferrars doesn't break his engagement with Lucy Steele because it would have been very improper. So it's up to the lady in that. So this is where the lady has a little bit more power. Not always, unfortunately. Sometimes the guardian, the father, the brother could, for the lady, create an engagement and then inform the lady that now she was engaged to a certain gentleman. This we saw happen in Bridgerton, didn't we, with poor Daphne and Burbrook, which was a terrible match, but unfortunately was things that happened at that time as well. Now, you might be asking, okay, well, I kind of understand the Regency aspect of that. We have a lot of excellent examples in some of Jane Austen's work. What about later in the 1800s? Now, Regency is usually early 1800s to the 1820s, 1830s, and then the Victorian era takes over around 1837 to the turn of the century, to 1900. And that's when Queen Victoria became queen and just kind of changed the world. It's also the Industrial Revolution, and a lot of things were changing, including the practices of courtship and just relationships with people in general. So the courtship, especially in the higher class, took quite a long time actually to change. You would find if you were in Victorian England that maybe there was a little bit more romance, and that wasn't there in the Regency, which tended to be a lot of a business transaction. And so maybe then you could start sending letters to each other, and it would be a little bit more okay to send it through the post, and maybe it would have a lovely poem in it, and you really started to be able to show slightly more affection in public, but not much more. We cannot assume anything. And one of the things that happened at that time too was the celebration of Valentine's Day and purchasing Valentines. Now, if you were romantically inclined and could write a little poem for your intended, or the person that you were most attracted to, that's wonderful, but a lot of gentlemen found that they could not, that those words did not come easy to them. And so what they did was they started to purchase pre-made Valentines. And that's when our Valentines, the pre-made ones that you would go to a store and purchase and send to whoever it is you're interested in, became very popular. So that's also when, in the Victorian age, during the Industrial Revolution, that we realized that there's a lot of money in romance as well. and that's where we get actually quite a few of the traditions that we have today. Now, courtship during the Victorian era was kind of the same. You would meet somebody, or somebody would introduce you to someone. You would court, where you would still have to be accompanied by a chaperone at all times, of course. And at certain hours of the day, you could leave a calling card, you could send flowers, a lot of the same things that were in the Regency period as well. But again, we should note that much of this was what we're talking about is really the upper class, where it was very much a business transaction, where it was she has a certain amount of dowry and he has a certain amount of land, and this could be a really good match. Now, if you lived in the United States, for example, at the time, and this is later in the 1800s, not the early 1800s, where there's a lot more religion, I suppose, that was in the courtship. But in the later 1800s, it was similar to what it was like in England as well, in some of the larger cities. But you should also note that a lot of people were traveling west and living kind of on the road, and it became also a more convenient thing in order to get married. And so courtship was almost more hurried in some ways, where you're like, okay, well, I need someone to support me and to build a new life with out west, maybe, for example, in California. And so it wasn't as much of a business thing where it's, oh, you've got this much, I've got this much, we're going to work really well together, but it was a partnership. It was something that, okay, we can do this together and we can build our life together. And I think one of the good examples of this, of maybe somebody who wasn't in the upper class and who lived more on the frontier in the United States, is Laura Ingalls Wilder, who was in fact being courted in the, I think, 1860s, 1870s by eventually her husband, Almanzo. And if you are familiar with those books have Laura and Almanza going out on carriage rides off for miles and miles, and they were allowed to be alone. So there is differences there that we start to see where, okay, well, her reputation wasn't ruined just because she was with a gentleman. But it was still much more refrained. Engagement rings during this time started to be a little bit more popular too. In the Regency period, you didn't need an engagement ring in order to prove that you loved someone. But during the Victorian period, that became a lot more popular in order to have engagement rings and a token of your love for this person as well. So California too, at the time, if you lived here, well, if you were a lady, you were outnumbered quite a bit with men. And so you could probably have much more of a pick among the men and whoever could provide for you the best. Again, maybe a business sort of aspect of it where you're wondering, how can we combine our assets and make something great? And that's actually how the upper class kind of stayed in power for a long time, with land ownership and whatnot in Regency England in particular. But out here too, it could have been a little bit more for affection as well. But if you did live in Regency and you did live in Victorian England, just love didn't really have a huge place in the courtship. Love was almost considered immature. It was an infatuation, and it wasn't going to find you a good husband. If you are familiar with perhaps this book, Georgette Heyer, The Grand Sophie, one of the main characters is completely infatuated with a poet, of course, where she is just in love with this man, but he has absolutely no means of providing for her. but she just falls in love with him because he writes so many beautiful things about her, and he's infatuated with her. And well, the grand Sophie, of course, if you haven't read the book, I won't give too much away, but looks at this and thinks, this is not a good match. It won't leave them happy. And so you had to think about that too, where what's going to happen to yourself in these later periods. Now, courtship was a very important time in these ladies' lives. If you were a gentleman, you would probably start courting around the age of 21. That's when you kind of came of age. So 21 or higher was appropriate. Ladies started a bit earlier in their teens, usually not before 15, probably closer to 18, somewhere in there. And if you've read the Laura Ingalls Wilder books, her father makes her wait until she's 18 in order to get married. I think that's more than fair. Okay, but I think it's easy to look at these things and read your romance novels and look at it kind of with these rose-tinted glasses. And I wonder why we do that. Why do we look at these and look at the past sometimes and romanticize these things that are happening instead of sort of the reality of the situation, that these ladies during their courtships are kind of having the best time of their life. Yes, there's pressure because you need to make a good match, but also you're out in society, you get to talk to these gentlemen, and then afterwards, even in all of Jane Austen's novels, they just kind of end at the marriage. Right? And so you never really find out what happens afterwards, but there's different expectations after you become a married woman. And so I think it's easy to look at these with a romantic notion, maybe not a realistic notion, and want to feel that special. And I think that's a very normal thing for us all to feel, is we don't want just a single day in order to feel special in a special month like February, and we don't need just like a special occasion to give that special someone that nice feeling. And so we kind of read these different things, but maybe that's how I feel about it. Perhaps you all have different thoughts on why we like to read all these and why we look at this past through a different lens and feel these things and want to feel these things. But that's just me, and well, that's the tea.